September 8, 1943. Tokyo, Japan. The air inside the Prime Minister's official residence felt heavy, trapped beneath the late summer heat and the weight of bad news traveling faster than any aircraft. A naval aide stepped through the corridor with a message folder pressed against his chest. His shoes made sharp, careful sounds on the polished floor. Outside, the capital was dimmed by blackout precautions, its streets guarded against American bombers that had not yet come in force but were already imagined in every planning room. Inside, the men who ruled Japan were learning that one of their Axis partners had broken. Italy had surrendered. The words did not arrive as a rumor. They came through diplomatic channels, intercepted reports, and German communications. Marshal Pietro Badoglio's government had accepted an armistice with the Allies. Rome was no longer a reliable partner in the war against Britain and America. The Mediterranean front, already battered, had cracked open. The Axis, which had once promised to encircle the British Empire from Europe and Asia, now looked less like a steel ring and more like a chain losing its links. Prime Minister General Hideki Tojo received the news with the rigid self-control expected of a soldier. He had built his public image on discipline, resolve, and sacrifice. Yet even he could not treat Italy's collapse as a distant European matter. Japan had entered the tripartite pact believing that Germany and Italy would hold the West at bay while Japan reshaped Asia and the Pacific. Now Italy had stepped out of the war, not after victory, but under the pressure of invasion, bombing, and political collapse. Tojo's face gave little away as the reports were read. Around him sat men from the army, navy, foreign ministry, and imperial general headquarters. Their uniforms differed. Their rivalries were old, but in that room they understood one thing with unusual clarity. Italy's surrender was more than a military event. It was a warning. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, who had taken office only months earlier, studied the implications with the eye of a diplomat who knew how fragile alliances could become when fortunes turned. Japan's embassy networks had already reported anxiety in Europe. German forces were stretched from the Eastern Front to the Atlantic, from the Balkans to Italy itself. If the Wehrmacht now had to occupy former Italian territory, disarm Italian units, and defend the Italian peninsula against the Allies, Berlin's burden would grow heavier at the exact moment when Japan needed Germany to remain strong. The Japanese leaders did not say this aloud in panicked voices. They spoke in controlled phrases, coded by bureaucracy and military habit. Italy's withdrawal was called a serious development. The situation in Europe was described as grave. The need for stronger coordination with Germany was emphasized. But beneath those formal words was a more dangerous thought. If Italy could fall away, could Germany one day do the same? You can imagine the silence after that thought entered the room. No officer wanted to be the first to sound defeatist. No minister wanted to suggest that the Axis might lose the war. Yet the surrender of Italy forced every man present to look beyond slogans. The Imperial Japanese Navy had already suffered a major reversal at Midway. Guadalcanal had been abandoned earlier that year after months of blood, starvation, disease, and naval loss. In New Guinea, Japanese soldiers were fighting in jungles where supply lines dissolved into mud. American shipyards were launching vessels at a pace Japan could not match. The empire still looked vast on the map, but inside its perimeter the strain was growing. Army leaders worried about the meaning of morale. If Italy, a major Axis power, could be bombed, invaded, and politically broken, then Allied propaganda would become sharper. Enemy leaflets and radio broadcasts would tell occupied Asia that the Axis was collapsing. They would tell Japanese soldiers that their allies were abandoning them. They would tell civilians that sacrifice led only to ruin. Navy leaders saw another danger. Italy's fleet, once a factor tying down British power in the Mediterranean, was no longer a dependable threat. British and American naval strength might shift more freely. Every Allied resource released in Europe could eventually move toward the Indian Ocean or the Pacific. The Japanese Navy, already trying to defend too many islands with too little fuel, understood what that meant. A war that had begun with bold strikes and fast advances was becoming a contest of endurance. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler reacted to Italy's armistice with rage and military speed. German troops moved to seize control of Italian positions. Mussolini would soon be rescued and placed at the head of a German-backed puppet state in northern Italy. But Tokyo's leaders knew that such actions did not erase the damage. They only proved that Germany now had another battlefield to manage. The tripartite pact still existed on paper. Japanese newspapers could still speak of unity. Officials could still declare confidence in final victory. But inside the highest chambers of Tokyo, confidence had begun to change shape. It was no longer the aggressive confidence of 1941 when Japanese carrier decks had roared toward Pearl Harbor. It was becoming something harder, colder, and more defensive. Tojo and the men around him would not abandon the war because Italy had abandoned the Axis. Their response was not surrender. It was tightening, more discipline, more sacrifice, more insistence that Japan must fight on, regardless of Europe's failures. But the first crack had been heard, and every leader in Tokyo knew that cracks spread. September 9th, 1943. Imperial General Headquarters, Tokyo. Morning light came pale through curtained windows, filtered by paper screens and wartime cushion. Maps lay open across long tables. Europe was far away, but on those maps distance looked deceptive. Thin black lines connected Rome, Berlin, Moscow, Singapore, Rabaul, Truk, and Tokyo into one immense problem. The officers gathered around those maps were not thinking of Italy as a romantic land of ruins and old empires. They were thinking of ports, airfields, divisions, fuel, shipping lanes, and Allied pressure. Italy's surrender meant that Germany would have to divert men, aircraft, and materials south. The Wehrmacht would have to hold the Italian peninsula like a shield against Allied armies climbing north from the beaches. German commanders would have to occupy Rome, secure rail lines, disarm former Italian units, and replace a broken ally with German blood. For Japan, this was a strategic warning written in another theater. A staff officer from the army traced the Mediterranean with his finger. The Allies had taken Sicily. Southern Italy was exposed if German forces were pinned down there. How many fewer divisions could face the Soviet Union in the east? How much more pressure would fall on Berlin, and if Germany weakened under that pressure, what would happen to Japan, isolated across the oceans? No one in the room needed to say that Japan had counted on Germany to keep Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States divided. That expectation had shaped the gamble of 1941. The German invasion of the Soviet Union had seemed, for a time, to promise a Europe consumed by continental war. Britain had appeared exhausted. America, before Pearl Harbor, had seemed distant, powerful, but not yet fully mobilized. Japanese leaders had calculated that speed, shock, and distance could win them an empire before the enemy could gather strength. By September 1943, those calculations had aged badly. The Americans were no longer distant. They were advancing through the Solomons, building airfields, improving tactics, and learning how to break Japanese island defenses one by one. Their submarines were tightening around shipping routes. Their factories were producing aircraft, carriers, destroyers, landing craft, trucks, radios, and ammunition in volumes that Japanese planners found almost unreal. Britain, though strained, still fought. China had not been defeated. The Soviet Union, instead of collapsing, had survived Stalingrad and was pushing Germany backward. Now Italy had fallen out of the Axis. The news sharpened an old fear inside Tokyo. Germany might still be formidable, But Germany was no longer advancing with the unstoppable momentum that had impressed Japanese observers in 1940 and 1941. Its armies were reacting, plugging holes, rushing reserves, answering crisis after crisis. Italy's surrender meant one more emergency that Berlin had to contain. At the Foreign Ministry, Mamoru Shigemitsu studied the diplomatic dimension. Japan could not publicly admit that Axis unity had suffered a severe blow. Official language had to remain steady. The people had to hear that Italy's betrayal, weakness, or internal confusion did not alter Japan's sacred mission. Newspapers would frame the event carefully. The enemy would be blamed. Badoglio's government would be condemned. German firmness would be praised. Mussolini loyalists, if they could be presented as continuing the fight, would be useful for propaganda. But Shigemitsu and other senior officials understood that words could not change the basic reality. Italy had judged that continuing the war meant national ruin. That judgment, even if Tokyo rejected it, now existed as an example. Inside the Army Ministry, general officers thought in harsher terms. To them, Italy had failed because its people and leaders lacked spiritual strength. They believed Japan was different. Japan had the emperor, Kokutai, Bushido, and a national spirit that would not bend under bombing or invasion. This was not merely propaganda for many of them. It was a conviction, repeated so often in military schools and official speeches that it became a wall against doubt. Yet even behind that wall, anxiety moved. What if spirit could not replace oil? What if loyalty could not build ships? What if discipline could not stop American production? Italy's surrender forced those questions closer to the surface. The Japanese army could dismiss Italian weakness, but it could not dismiss the pattern. The Axis had lost North Africa. The Axis had lost Sicily. Now Italy itself had changed sides. The enemy was not merely resisting. The enemy was advancing. Tojo's reaction carried the same contradiction. Publicly, he had to project absolute determination. Privately, he had to ask what the war now demanded. Japan could not expect relief from Europe. It could not assume that Germany would draw away enough American strength to save the Pacific. It could not trust that the Axis partnership would produce a coordinated path to victory. Japan had to prepare for a longer, lonelier war. That realization did not produce moderation. It produced severity. In meetings, leaders spoke of reinforcing the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, tightening control over occupied territories, increasing production, securing resources, and hardening defensive positions. They spoke of making the enemy pay such a terrible price that Washington and London might accept negotiation coup if Germany now carried more weight in Europe. Japan would carry more weight in Asia. The alliance was still valuable, but it no longer felt equal. It felt like two wounded powers leaning away from collapse in different directions. A Navy officer looking at the Pacific map could see the danger in physical form. From the Central Pacific, American forces might drive toward the Marshalls, the Carolines, the Marianas. From the Southwest Pacific, they might climb through New Guinea toward the Philippines. Each island looked small, but each demanded ships, aircraft, fuel, engineers, food, ammunition, and men. The empire was a vast defensive screen, but a screen could become a trap if the enemy chose where to strike. Italy's surrender made that trap easier to imagine. By evening, the first official Japanese responses were being shaped. The tone would be defiant. The message would be unity with Germany. The implication would be that Italy's collapse was a shameful exception, not a prophecy. Leaders would insist that Japan remained firm, that the war continued, that the spirit of the nation was unbroken, but in the guarded rooms where reports were not softened for public ears. Italy's abandonment of the Axis had already changed the atmosphere. Men who had once spoken of victory through offensive action now spoke more often of endurance. Men who had once expected Europe to exhaust Japan's enemies now wondered whether Europe would free them. The war had not ended in Rome, but in Tokyo. The surrender sounded like a door closing. September 10th, 1943. Tokyo. The official language began to form before the ink had dried on the latest cables. In government offices, editors, military spokesmen, and information officials prepared the words that would reach the Japanese public. Italy had not simply surrendered. They would imply it had been misled, betrayed from within, weakened by cowardice, and separated from the true fighting spirit of the Axis. Germany remained firm. Japan remained firm. The war remained sacred. Victory still depended on endurance, sacrifice, and obedience. This was what the public could be told. But inside the guarded rooms of power, the same event had a different sound. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo understood the usefulness of anger. Anger could discipline a nation. Anger could turn anxiety outward. If Italy was called treacherous, then Japanese citizens did not have to ask whether Italy had seen the future more clearly than Tokyo. If Badoglio was condemned as faithless, then no one had to ask whether Japan's own position might one day become equally desperate. Rage was safer than doubt, so the public tone hardened. Italy had broken faith. Italy had weakened the common front. Italy had failed the test of national will. Yet the leaders who approved this language knew that condemnation could not repair the strategic damage. German power had been forced into another emergency. The Allied armies had gained a foothold on the European mainland. The Mediterranean had shifted. British and American confidence would rise. Every speech in Tokyo could call Italy's decision shameful. But shame did not stop enemy ships. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu faced the problem with the caution of a man who knew that diplomacy often required saying one thing while preparing for another. Japan could not distance itself from Germany. That would signal weakness. It could not admit that the Axis had suffered a major political fracture. That would encourage the enemy. It could not openly question Berlin's ability to continue the war. That would wound the alliance at the very moment when Tokyo still needed it. So the message had to be balanced like a blade. Japan would reaffirm loyalty to Germany. Japan would denounce the Italian government that had accepted the armistice. Japan would express confidence that the true fascist forces, still loyal to Mussolini, would continue resisting. Japan would insist that the Axis cause had not died with Rome's decision. These statements were meant not only for Japanese civilians, but for Berlin, for occupied Asia, for neutral states, and for the Allies listening through intelligence channels. Every word mattered. In the army, the reaction was more severe and more personal. Senior officers judged nations by willpower, sacrifice, discipline, and obedience to authority. To them, Italy's collapse proved the danger of weak leadership and civilian hesitation. They believed that once politicians and royal courts began to think of survival instead of victory, defeat spread like infection. The fall of Mussolini in July had already troubled them. Now the armistice seemed to confirm their darkest interpretation. A nation did not lose only on the battlefield. It lost first in the mind. This belief became a shield for Japanese leaders. It allowed them to explain Italy's surrender without admitting that material power mattered more than spirit. Italy had not fallen because Allied industry was overwhelming. It had fallen because morale failed. Italy had not surrendered because bombing, invasion, and blockade had made the war unbearable. It had surrendered because its leaders lacked resolve. Japan, they insisted, would never follow that path. But beneath that confidence lay fear. American aircraft were growing more numerous. American submarines were cutting deeper into Japan's lifelines. The Solomons campaign had shown that Japanese troops could fight with extraordinary courage and still lose when food, ammunition, medicine, and air cover disappeared. Guadalcanal had become a name spoken with restraint, because too much honesty about it would reveal the cost of the war. New Guinea was consuming men in jungle misery. The Aleutians had already shown that isolated garrisons could become symbols of death rather than strength. If Japan's own outer defenses were broken, would leaders still speak only of spirit? In naval circles, Italy's surrender carried another lesson. The Italian fleet had been one of the few major naval forces aligned against Britain. Its fate after the armistice showed how quickly ships could become political instruments. A fleet could steam out under orders, lower its flag in effect, and cease to serve the alliance that had built its strategy around it. Japanese admirals did not expect such disloyalty from their own navy, but they understood the broader warning. When the state cracked, military assets could not save it. The combined fleet remained powerful, but it was no longer the striking force of December 1941. Carrier losses, pilot losses, fuel shortages, and the immense reach of American industry had changed the naval war. Younger officers still spoke of decisive battle, the great encounter that would destroy the United States Pacific Fleet. Older planners still kept that doctrine alive, but the opportunities for such a battle were shrinking. The enemy no longer needed to rush blindly into Japan's preferred trap. It could advance methodically, island by island, under air cover, with logistics that seemed to renew themselves endlessly. Italy's surrender added psychological pressure to that reality. It suggested that the enemy alliance could absorb time better than the Axis could. Britain and America could lose campaigns and return stronger. Germany and Japan could win victories and still find themselves weaker months later. Italy had been the first Axis capital to break under that imbalance. In Tokyo's newspapers, the story was made smaller and simpler. The people would read that the war must continue with greater determination. They would read that Italy's failure exposed the corruption of those who abandoned duty. They would read that Japan and Germany stood together. The language would be stern, patriotic, and controlled. But behind the printing presses, officials worried about what ordinary citizens might think when they read between the lines. They knew Japanese families had sons in China, Burma, New Guinea, the Solomons, and across the Pacific Islands. They knew mothers waited for letters that came late or never. They knew rationing was biting harder. They knew industrial workers were tired. Students were being mobilized, and villages were giving more rice, more labor, more men. If Italians had decided that the price was too high, might some Japanese quietly wonder the same? This was why the official reaction had to be fierce. Not because Tokyo believed Italy's surrender was meaningless, but because it knew the event was dangerous. A crack in an alliance could become a crack in imagination, and imagination was where defeat first became possible. In the cabinet rooms, the military offices, and the imperial general headquarters, Japan's leaders forced the conclusion they needed. Italy had failed because it was not Japan. Germany would recover because it had to. The Axis would continue because admitting otherwise was impossible. The empire would fight on because every alternative looked like dishonor, occupation, and the destruction of the national polity. So they chose defiance. But from that week forward, the words of confidence sounded more strained. The speeches grew louder because the silence beneath them had grown deeper. Italy's abandonment of the Axis had not changed Japan's official purpose, but it had changed the emotional weather of the war. The leaders still spoke of final victory. They still invoked destiny, loyalty, and sacrifice. Yet somewhere behind the formal phrases, a new question had entered the room and refused to leave. If one Axis partner could fall, how long before another stood alone? September 11th, 1943. Tokyo. Rain moved across the city in thin gray sheets, tapping on the tiled roofs, running down the dark windows of government buildings, turning the streets into ribbons of reflected lantern light. Inside the foreign ministry, the weather seemed to match the mood. Clerks carried cables from Berlin, Rome, Madrid, Stockholm, and other listening posts where Japanese diplomats tried to understand a war that was changing faster than official statements could admit. The messages did not arrive with drama. They came in stiff diplomatic language, typed lines, coded phrases, and carefully measured assessments. But when read together, they told a brutal story. The Axis was no longer what it had claimed to be. In 1940, when Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, the alliance had been sold as a warning to the United States. Three great powers would stand together. Europe and Asia would be reshaped. Any nation that entered the war against one of them would face all of them. To Japanese leaders, the pact had offered psychological power. It suggested that Japan would not stand alone against the Western empires. It suggested that Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo were part of a rising world order. Now one capital had broken away. Italy's surrender did not simply remove divisions from the Axis order of battle. It damaged the myth. It made the pact look less like destiny and more like convenience. And convenience could disappear under pressure. Mamoru Shigemitsu understood this better than most. He knew that alliances survived not on ceremony, but on the belief that each partner still had something to offer. Germany still had armies, factories, submarines, rockets under development, and the power to hold down enormous Allied strength in Europe. Japan still had territory, air bases, resources, and millions of men under arms. But coordination between Berlin and Tokyo had always been limited by geography. The Soviet Union stood between them. Allied control of the seas made direct exchange difficult. Submarines could carry blueprints, specialists, small cargoes, and messages. But they could not carry armies or oil on a scale that could change the war. Italy had at least offered the Axis a Mediterranean front, a navy, and political weight in Europe. Now that weight had shifted against them in Tokyo. This led to hard questions. Could Germany still force Britain and America to concentrate their main strength in Europe? Could it still contain the Soviet Union? Could it still threaten the Atlantic enough to delay the full American turn toward the Pacific? If the answer to any of these questions became no, Japan's strategic horizon darkened at once. At Imperial General Headquarters, army officers studied the German position with a mixture of admiration and unease. They respected German discipline. They admired German operational skill. They had watched the early victories in Poland, France, the Balkans, and the Soviet Union with professional fascination. For Japanese soldiers, Germany had seemed proof that boldness, speed, and will could destroy larger coalitions. But by late 1943, the German example no longer carried only inspiration, it carried warning. Germany had won too much too quickly, then found itself holding too much against too many enemies. Japan's own empire had followed a similar pattern. The early months after Pearl Harbor had been intoxicating. Hong Kong fell. Malaya fell. Singapore fell. The Philippines were conquered. The Netherlands East Indies yielded oil fields. Burma was invaded. Across Asia, the Western colonial order appeared to collapse in weeks. But conquest created appetite, and appetite created distance. Every island seized had to be supplied. Every airfield had to be defended. Every garrison needed food, medicine, ammunition, and replacement men. Every new perimeter line demanded ships Japan could not easily replace. The empire that had looked magnificent on the paper now required constant motion from a merchant fleet under attack by submarines and aircraft. The deeper the war went, the more Japan discovered that holding territory could be harder than taking it. Italy's surrender forced leaders to see the pattern in another mirror. A nation could occupy land and still lose control of time. Tojo's inner circle did not discuss these matters like frightened civilians. They discussed them as men trapped by their own earlier decisions. Japan had attacked the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands because leaders believed delay would make Japan weaker. American embargoes had tightened. Oil stocks were finite. Negotiations had stalled. The empire either had to accept limits or gamble for strategic independence. They chose the gamble. Now the gamble had entered its second, harsher stage. In public, Tojo could not sound uncertain. He had to show that Italy's abandonment only strengthened Japan's resolve. His speeches emphasized unity, discipline, and the duty of 100 million people to serve the state. He spoke as though national spirit could close every gap in steel and fuel. His listeners bowed, applauded, and repeated the slogans. Yet within the machinery of government, the tone of planning became more defensive. Japan would fortify key positions. Japan would prepare for a decisive struggle closer to the inner perimeter. Japan would demand greater production from workers, students, women, and colonial subjects. Japan would extract more from Korea, Taiwan, Manchuria, occupied China, Southeast Asia, and the islands under military rule. The empire would tighten its fist because loosening it seemed impossible. This was one of the clearest effects of Italy's surrender. It did not make Tokyo seek peace. It made Tokyo fear weakness so much that it doubled down on endurance. The Navy, however, could not ignore the arithmetic. Fuel was the blood of ships, and Japan had less of it than its ambitions required. Tankers were vulnerable. Refineries were limited. Training new pilots consumed fuel that could not be spared. Sending fleets into battle required calculations that grew more painful with every month. Admirals who still believed in a decisive engagement had to ask whether they would have enough trained air crews, enough carriers, enough oil, and enough intelligence to make such a battle possible. Italy's fleet had not saved Italy. This fact lingered in naval minds. Ships could be beautiful, powerful, and brave. But if the nation behind them lost air cover, fuel, political unity, and strategic position, steel hulls became stranded symbols. Japan's combined fleet still inspired pride, yet pride could not replace trained pilots lost over the Solomons, could not raise sunken carriers, could not stop American radar, and could not match American construction. At the Army Ministry, officers responded to such doubts with the language of will. They argued that Japan's strength lay in spiritual mobilization. If the enemy advanced, each island would become a fortress. If supplies failed, soldiers would live off the land. If ammunition ran low, they would attack at close range. If the enemy landed, every beach would become a killing ground. Italy had surrendered because it had forgotten how to die for the state. Japan would not forget. These words sounded powerful in conference rooms. They sounded noble in newspapers, but on the front lines, they meant hunger, disease, isolation, and death. In Burma, soldiers sweated in dense jungle, listening for aircraft through the trees. In New Guinea, men carried supplies through mud that swallowed boots and pack animals alike. On remote Pacific islands, garrisons watched the sea and wondered whether the next ships on the horizon would bring rice or shells. The empire's leaders spoke of resolve, but resolve was being spent by men whose names rarely reached Tokyo. Italy's surrender also changed how Japanese leaders imagined the enemy. The Allies now appeared more coordinated, more patient, more capable of using pressure across theaters. They had struck North Africa, then Sicily, then mainland Italy. They were bombing Germany. They were supplying the Soviet Union. They were advancing in the Pacific. They could choose the rhythm of war more and more often. The Axis, by contrast, reacted. Japan reacted in the Solomons. Germany reacted in Italy. Both reacted to Allied production. Both reacted to bombing. Both reacted to shortages. The alliance that once promised initiative now found itself defending too many fronts. Late that night, As rain continued over Tokyo, a senior official leaving a meeting paused beneath the entrance roof while his car was brought forward. The city smelled of wet stone, coal smoke, and damp paper. Somewhere beyond the darkness were factories running under dim lights, families stretching rations, soldiers boarding trains, and radio announcers preparing the next message of confidence. The official knew what would be said. Italy's fall would be condemned. Germany's strength would be praised. Japan's determination would be declared absolute. But he also knew what could not be said, that the Axis had lost more than a partner. It had lost the illusion that history moved only in its direction. September 12th, 1943. Tokyo. The morning began with the smell of damp uniforms, cigarette smoke, and ink. Across the capital, orders moved through the machinery of the Japanese state. They traveled from conference rooms to ministries, from ministries to military districts, from military districts to arsenals, ports, schools, newspapers, and police offices. Italy's surrender had been absorbed into policy. The shock was no longer just a subject of discussion. It had become a reason to tighten everything. In the Prime Minister's residence, Hideki Tojo listened as reports outlined the national mood. Officials spoke carefully. They did not say that the people were frightened. They said vigilance must be strengthened. They did not say that news of Italy could encourage doubt. They said hostile propaganda must be countered. They did not say that the Axis looked weaker. They said Japan must display unshakable unity before the world. Tojo understood the language. Every regime at war develops words that hide danger from the very men responsible for facing it. But he also understood the truth beneath the phrases. The enemy would use Italy's surrender as a weapon. American and British broadcasters would tell Asia that the Axis was breaking. Chinese resistance leaders would tell occupied territories that Japan's defeat was only a matter of time. Soviet observers would watch for signs of weakness. Neutral diplomats would measure Tokyo's tone and report whether the Japanese still believed in victory. The answer Tokyo chose was force. More force in speech, more force in production, more force in discipline, more force in the demand that every subject of the empire accept hardship without complaint. At the Information Bureau, writers prepared articles that transformed Italy's surrender into a moral lesson. The Italian people had been failed by corrupt leaders. Their government had forgotten loyalty. Their soldiers had been betrayed by politicians and monarchists. The Japanese people, by contrast, were bound to the emperor in a unity no Western nation could understand. Japan would not bargain away its destiny. Japan would not collapse under bombing. Japan would not imitate Rome. This was the message that would flow through newspapers and radio broadcasts. But in closed briefings, officers spoke less about morality and more about consequences. German forces now had to hold Italy by themselves. The Allies had a path into southern Europe. The Mediterranean situation might free shipping and aircraft over time. American confidence would rise. Britain would claim that one Axis power had already been removed. The Soviet Union would welcome anything that diverted German strength. Every consequence pointed in one direction. Japan had to expect less relief from Europe and more pressure in Asia. At Imperial General Headquarters, maps of the Pacific received renewed attention. The outer perimeter looked increasingly fragile. The Solomons had already become a costly lesson. New Guinea remained a wound that would not close. The Central Pacific Islands stood like stepping stones across an ocean the Americans were learning to cross with terrifying efficiency. Japanese officers marked bases, air ranges, shipping routes, and likely invasion targets. The names sounded remote to civilians, but to planners they were the hinges of survival. Rabaul, Truk, Kwajalein, Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, Palau, the Philippines. Each name carried questions. How many aircraft could be stationed there? How many runways could be repaired after bombing? How much food was stored? How many ships were available to reinforce it? Could the garrison resist without naval support? Could the Navy risk naval support at all? Italy's surrender did not answer these questions. It made them more urgent. The Japanese Army and Navy still argued over priorities. The Army remained tied to China and mainland Asia, where enormous numbers of soldiers were locked into a war that had consumed Japan since 1937. The Navy looked east and south toward the American advance. Each service guarded its resources. Each distrusted the other's judgment. The fall of Italy should have encouraged unified planning, but rivalry did not disappear because danger increased. Sometimes danger made rivalry sharper. An army officer could say the decisive struggle lay in defending the resource zones and the Asian mainland. A Navy officer could answer that without control of the sea. No resource zone could feed the empire. The Army could demand shipping for troops and supplies. The Navy could reply that ships without escorts would become graves. Both were correct, and that was the tragedy. Japan needed everything at once and had too little of almost all of it. In these discussions, Germany appeared as both ally and warning. Some officers argued that Berlin would respond to Italy's betrayal with ruthless efficiency. German troops would stabilize the front. Mussolini's loyalists would be reorganized. The Allies would be slowed in mountains and cities. Germany had survived worse shocks. They said it would continue to hold the majority of Allied attention. Others were less certain. They pointed to the Eastern Front. They pointed to the bombing of German cities. They pointed to the growing scale of American industry. They pointed to the simple fact that a great power forced to rescue its own ally was weaker than one advancing by choice. If Germany became fully defensive, Japan would be left to face the Pacific War with fewer strategic distractions dividing the enemy. No one wanted to say Germany might lose, but more and more men were planning as if Germany might not win. That distinction mattered. Official faith remained intact. Practical confidence was eroding. Tojo's government responded by demanding deeper mobilization. Students would be pulled closer to war work. Factories would be pressed to increase output despite shortages. Women would be organized into labor and civil defense roles. Rural communities would surrender more food and sons. Police surveillance would watch for defeatist talk. Schools would teach children that hardship was honor. The language of sacrifice expanded until it touched every household. For ordinary Japanese families, Italy's surrender was not presented as a reason to question the war. It was presented as proof that weak nations perished when they lost spirit. A mother sending her son to military service would hear that Japan must be stronger than Italy. A worker in an aircraft plant would hear that each rivet struck a blow against the enemy. A schoolboy drilling with a wooden rifle would hear that loyalty was the difference between empire and ruin. The state turned fear into obedience. Yet fear did not vanish simply because it had been given orders. In private, some officials wondered how long the people could endure bad news disguised as resolve. They knew that the gap between official claims and battlefield reality was widening. They knew that each withdrawal had to be described as adjustment, each defeat as heroic resistance, each shortage as an opportunity for patriotic discipline. Italy's surrender made that gap harder to hide because it was not a Japanese defeat that could be buried in distant geography. It was a world event. It was visible. It was undeniable. The enemy had knocked one pillar from the Axis structure. The remaining pillars had to pretend the roof was not sagging. On September 12th, another development reached Japanese attention. German forces had rescued Benito Mussolini from captivity and placed him back into the struggle under German protection. For Tokyo's propagandists, this was useful. Mussolini could be portrayed as the true Italy, still loyal, still fighting, still standing beside Germany and Japan. The shame could be shifted onto Badoglio, the king, and those who had accepted surrender. But the rescue also revealed the weakness it was meant to conceal. A leader once hailed as the founder of fascist power now survived only because German commandos had pulled him from imprisonment. His restored authority depended on German arms. His new state would exist under German shadow. To Japanese officials who read between the lines, this did not look like renewal. It looked like salvage. Still, salvage was better than nothing. Tokyo seized the image because it needed any sign that the Axis had not completely fractured. Newspapers could praise Mussolini's return. Commentators could insist that true fascist Italy continued the war. Diplomats could reassure Berlin that Japan remained loyal. The story gave officials a way to speak of continuity while ignoring the deeper rupture. But strategic reality did not obey propaganda. The Allies were on Italian soil. German troops were spread thinner. The Soviet front remained immense. The Atlantic War continued. In the Pacific, American pressure increased. The Axis could still fight, still kill, still resist with terrible strength. But its promise of shared victory had become a promise of shared endurance. In the afternoon, Tojo met with senior military men whose faces showed exhaustion beneath discipline. They spoke of air defense, shipping, aircraft production, pilot training, island fortification, and home front morale. Italy's surrender hovered over every subject without needing constant mention. It was the unseen comparison. It was the example no one wished to follow and no one could fully ignore. One officer argued that the nation must be prepared psychologically for a decisive defensive war. Another warned that enemy morale would rise after Italy. A third insisted that Japan's spiritual foundation made collapse impossible. Tojo listened, questioned, and approved measures that moved the country further into total war. Outside, Tokyo continued under rationing and blackout rules. Streetcars carried workers. Children passed military posters. Families bowed before household shrines and listened to official broadcasts that spoke with confidence from wooden radios. The war still felt distant to many, yet it was entering the room through food, labor, uniforms, telegrams, and silence. Italy had surrendered thousands of miles away, but the response in Tokyo reached into Japanese homes. It told the people to harden. It told soldiers to expect less mercy. It told ministers to speak louder. It told generals and admirals that the window for victory had narrowed. And beneath all those commands lay the truth that no order could erase. The Axis had not died in September 1943, but it had changed shape. It was no longer a coalition promising a new world through attack. It was becoming a coalition trying to postpone defeat through endurance, punishment, and denial. Japan's leaders did not yet speak of collapse. They spoke of final victory. But the meaning of final victory had begun to retreat, step by step, from conquest toward survival. September 13th, 1943. Tokyo. Before dawn. The city rested in a darkness that was no longer peaceful. Blackout curtains covered windows. Police patrols moved through quiet streets. Factory chimneys stood against the faint edge of morning. In homes across the capital, families slept near ration books, military notices, and letters from sons stationed in places many parents could barely imagine. The war had become part of the furniture of daily life, always present, always demanding, always asking for more. Inside the offices of power, however, sleep was thin. Italy's surrender had now passed from emergency news into strategic reality. The first shock had faded, but what remained was more dangerous. Shock could be met with speeches. Reality had to be lived with. Every new cable from Europe, every report from the Pacific, every production chart and shipping table seemed to return Japanese leaders to the same conclusion. The Axis was weaker than it had been 1 week earlier. No official statement would say it that plainly. No newspaper headline would print it. No radio announcer would let those words pass into Japanese homes. But the men at the center of the state knew it. Italy had not merely changed sides. Italy had shown that an Axis power could be driven beyond endurance, that bombing, invasion, battlefield defeat and political fracture could combine until surrender became thinkable. For Tokyo, that was the most dangerous part. Not that Italy had failed. That surrender had become imaginable. Japan's leaders had built their wartime authority on the claim that national will could overcome material hardship. They had told the people that loyalty to the emperor made Japan different from Western nations. They had told soldiers that death was preferable to capture. They had told workers that exhaustion was service. They had told families that grief was honor. The entire structure depended on keeping one idea outside the mind of the nation. There must be no road back. Italy had found one. Tojo and his ministers answered this threat in the only way they believed possible. They closed ranks. They reaffirmed Germany. They condemned Badoglio. They praised Mussolini's return under German protection. They insisted that Japan's purpose had not changed. They demanded unity, labor, silence, and sacrifice. They treated doubt as a weapon of the enemy. Yet doubt did not always arrive as open rebellion. It could arrive as a pause before applause. It could arrive as a mother reading a casualty notice and remembering that another country had chosen to stop. It could arrive as a factory worker hearing that Italy had surrendered and wondering why the official broadcast sounded so angry. It could arrive as a junior officer studying American ship production and asking himself whether courage could sink vessels that had not yet been launched. The leadership feared this kind of doubt because it was quiet. Loud doubt could be punished. Quiet doubt could spread. In cabinet discussions, the word alliance still carried formal weight. Germany remained Japan's principal partner. Berlin still tied down vast Allied strength. German weapons, technology, and military experience still mattered. The struggle against Britain, America, and the Soviet Union still linked the Axis powers in a shared war. But the spirit of the alliance had changed. It no longer felt like a march toward a common victory. It felt like two distant fires burning in separate storms. Germany fought in Europe, under Allied bombing, against Soviet armies, holding Italy by force while trying to prevent invasion from the West. Japan fought across Asia and the Pacific, against American fleets, British forces, Chinese resistance, and the slow strangulation of distance and supply. The two powers could encourage each other, exchange messages, and celebrate defiance, but neither could save the other. This was what Italy's surrender exposed with cruel clarity. The Axis had never been a true integrated war machine. It was a political pact between ambitious powers whose wars overlapped more than they joined. Germany wanted domination of Europe. Italy had wanted empire and prestige, but lacked the strength to sustain its dreams. Japan wanted command over East Asia and the Pacific. Their enemies, by contrast, were learning to coordinate oceans, production, intelligence, shipping, and strategy. The Allies argued, delayed, and disagreed, but their weight was moving in the same direction. Japan could feel that weight now. In the Pacific, American forces were preparing for new blows. The lessons of Guadalcanal had been absorbed. Amphibious warfare was improving. Carrier groups were growing stronger. Submarines were becoming deadlier. Airfields were being carved from coral and jungle. Radar, code breaking, logistics, and industrial scale were turning distance from a Japanese shield into an American highway. Japanese planners saw fragments of this picture in reports. They did not always know where the next strike would fall, but they knew more strikes were coming. Italy's collapse suggested that the enemy could sustain pressure across theaters without losing momentum. The hope that the United States would tire quickly had faded. The hope that Germany would win decisively in Europe had dimmed. The hope that Japan could force negotiation through one great blow remained alive, but it was becoming more desperate. Still, no order came to seek peace. No serious public reconsideration followed. No confession of strategic error reached the people. Instead, the state moved further into the logic of resistance. If Italy had surrendered because its leaders lacked resolve, Japan would prove resolve by rejecting compromise. If Germany now carried more burden, Japan would show loyalty by fighting harder. If the Allies believed the Axis was breaking, Japan would answer with blood. This was the tragedy of the moment. Italy's surrender revealed danger, but it did not produce wisdom. It produced rigidity. The leaders of Japan looked at a collapsing partner and drew the lesson that collapse must be prevented by greater severity. They did not ask whether the war itself had become unwinnable. They asked how to make the nation endure an unwinnable shape for longer. They did not ask whether strategic assumptions had failed. They asked how to punish doubt, mobilize labor, fortify islands, and preserve morale. They did not ask whether Italy's exit proved that survival might require political courage. They treated it as proof that survival required no hesitation at all. By afternoon, official channels had settled into their rhythm. Statements praised Axis firmness. Newspapers framed the Italian armistice as betrayal. Military voices assured the public that Japan stood on a higher moral foundation. Germany's rapid action in Italy was presented as strength. Mussolini's rescue became evidence that the true Axis spirit continued. The words were polished, repeated, and sent outward. But words could not alter the map. Allied troops were in Italy. Germany was stretched thinner. The Soviet Union was advancing. Britain remained in the war. The United States was expanding its power across 2 oceans. Japan's merchant ships were sinking faster than they could be replaced. Its pilots were harder to train. Its fuel was harder to move. Its island bases were becoming targets instead of shields. In the evening, as lamps glowed behind covered windows, a senior aide carried another folder through another corridor. It contained reports from the Pacific, production figures, diplomatic summaries, and translations of enemy broadcasts. The ritual continued. Papers moved. Men read. Decisions formed. Orders left Tokyo. The empire still functioned. That was part of the illusion. A state can continue issuing orders long after its choices have narrowed. It can produce slogans while losing ships. It can demand sacrifice while losing time. It can punish defeatist talk while reality itself becomes defeatist. Japan in September 1943 had not reached the end, but it had entered a passage from which return would become harder with every month. Italy's abandonment of the Axis did not make Japanese leaders surrender. It made them speak more harshly, plan more defensively, and trust less in the promises of alliance. It made them fear that Germany would be forced to carry burdens it could not sustain. It made them understand, even if they would not admit it openly, that the Axis was no longer expanding history by conquest. It was defending itself against history's reply. And for the men in Tokyo, that reply sounded closer than before. Not as thunder yet, not as invasion, not as flames over the home islands. It came first as a message from Europe, read in a guarded room, stating that Italy had laid down its arms. From that moment, the leaders of Japan continued to say what they had to say. They said Germany would fight on. They said Japan would never break. They said the Axis spirit remained alive. They said sacrifice would bring victory. They said loyalty would overcome steel. They said the nation must harden itself against weakness. But beneath those words, something had changed. The alliance still existed. The war still continued. The empire still commanded. Yet the crack opened by Italy's surrender never fully closed.